Okay. So I wasn't particularly happy with how the first video went, and the reason for that is I feel like I fumbled the explanation somewhat. So this is going to be attempt 2, although actually it's attempt 3 because I made a pretty big error there on the second time. It's just you haven't been able to see that. So what we're going to go over is we're going to go over the diff settings that you have in iRacing. I'm just going to get that up on the screen for you right now. What we have here is we have our motorsport setup for the 911 RSI GTE car. Now, the reason I picked this is because I'm pretty familiar with it, and I had some problems with it this week, specifically related to this area. And in experiencing those problems, I was able to kind of get a bit of a better understanding for myself of how this all worked, and hopefully that'll translate into a bit of a video where I can kind of pass on some of that understanding to you. So what I've done here is I've just put all the values for the diff at their midpoints. And what I mean by that is, if you look, we can go between 30 and 70 degrees for a ramp angle on the coast setting. So the midpoint of that is 50. And we can go between 40 and 80 for the drive ramp. So the midpoint of that is 60. Clutch face is mostly the same. You can go between 2 and 12, so we're at 6. Preload, we can go between 0 and 200 newton meters, so we're at 100. Now, these 4 settings are pretty common across almost all mid to high tier cars for iRacing. So that's also another reason why I decided to use this car, because when you get options for the diff setting, you will usually have either all 4 of these or a combination of these 4. In some cases, you're only allowed to change things such as preload or ramp angles or number of clutch faces and preload. So I figured that this car has all 4. This car will do a decent job of demonstrating what each of these 4 do. So first off, what is the diff? Why do we even want to adjust it? What does it do? Well, the diff is responsible primarily, I say primarily because that kind of brings in the coast side of things a little bit. It's primarily responsible for transmitting power to the ground through the driven axle. Obviously, in a rear-wheel drive car, that's the 2 rear wheels, and the front-wheel drive car, it's the 2 front wheels. In a 4-wheel drive car, it's a bit more complicated because then you have things like a center diff and stuff. But the vast majority of cars on iRacing are rear-wheel drive cars, and so that's where we're going to focus, and that's where we're going to kind of focus the explanation on. So, in terms of diffs themselves, there's kind of 3 categories they can drop into. There is the open diff, the completely locked diff, so like the spool, and then there's the 3rd category, which is the limited slip diff, and these come in various different forms and so on, but the vast majority of iRacing ones kind of follow the clutch plate type design. So that works out for this. So the limited slip diff is a fancy way of basically saying that it's something in between a locked and an open diff. Okay, so why is that a helpful thing? Well, open diff is great for going around tight corners. It's great for any scenario where you're not on throttle, where you're just really trying to turn a corner. And the reason it's great for that is because the open diff will allow any difference in wheel speed from the inside to the outside wheel. That it will allow literally anything. You can have one wheel completely stopped and the other wheel will spin. But that's also kind of where its deficiency comes in the sense that if you do have a scenario where one wheel has no grip at all and the other wheel still has grip, the open diff does a really dumb thing where it will send all the power to the wheel that has no grip at all. And because it does that, you're not going to go anywhere. So its disadvantage is on low grip surfaces and corner exit and so on. It's just bad for getting the power down in any kind of straight line scenario. But okay, I say it's bad. It's not that it's bad. It's just that in a low grip scenario, it's not it's not great because what happens is it sends the power to the wheel that has the least grip. Now, lock diff has the opposite set of problems, where it ties the inside and the outside wheels rigidly to the same speed. They cannot turn at different speeds. So that makes it really bad for corners, because if you think about it, the arc that the inside wheel has to take for a corner is shorter than the one the outside wheel has to take. So for everything to meet up at the end, the outside wheel has to go faster than the inside wheel, or something has to slip. So what happens with the lock diff system is that it tries to resist this, especially if you're off throttle. Well, it tries to resist it if you're off throttle, because what it'll do is it'll act like it's completely it'll act like it's a completely solid kind of tube, and it doesn't want to turn, because if it has grip, then it'll try and push the car straight. So it's really bad in those scenarios. Now, the other thing it's bad for is that it also has kind of the opposite effect when you then try and put the power down. If the diff's completely locked, then what happens when you try and put the power down and you're in a corner is that it will actually try and kick the rear of the car out more. So really, it's only great in a straight line, which sounds like, okay, well, why would you ever want it? And it is helpful, because if you can get something that is kind of in between these two scenarios, we can try and have the best of everything. Now, it doesn't quite work like that, but it is enough that it makes it worthwhile trying to get the benefits of both. And that's really what the limited slip diff does. And that's where these options come in. What you can see here is that we have a coast ramp angle, a drive ramp angle, friction faces, and preload. Now, the coast ramp is only effective in off-throttle scenarios. So what we'd normally think is that, okay, if we're off throttle, then what we're trying to do normally in those scenarios, other than braking, is that we're trying to turn. So being able to adjust the off throttle ramp angle, you would think that you would want the diff to act more like an open diff, which is correct, because if you're completely off the throttle, then you're in a racing scenario, you're wanting to turn. That's your primary goal. Now, when we look at the drive ramp, it's kind of usually opposite. Most of the time, where we're heavily on the power, we're trying to get out of a corner, so we want as much traction as we want. So we want not maximum locking, because as we've said, maximum locking will cause an oversteer problem, but we want more than we do on the coast side. And that's really what these two settings allow you to do. They allow you to change kind of what I'm going to describe as the biasing between off-throttle and on-throttle behavior. And the way it does this is that the lower the number, the more the locking effect is. So what we can see here is, if we look at the coast ramp angle, we can see that we can go between 30 and 70 degrees. What this means is that at the 70-degree end, it's going to be acting more like an open diff, and at the 30-degree end, it's going to be acting more like a spool or a locked diff. And then everything in between is kind of, that's what we're tuning. So we're tuning how much it acts like either thing. And the same goes for the drive side. So the higher the angle for the drive side, the more like an open diff it is. The lower, the more like a locked diff it is. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the drive ramp angle first. And the reason we're gonna do that is because I found that this test I've kind of devised for it is a pretty good way of showing that. So as we said, the lower these numbers are, the more locking force there is, and the more it will act like a locked diff. Now, what does the clutch friction faces and the preload do? The clutch friction faces is a multiplier, really. The more clutch plates you have, the more overall locking effect there is. So why is that relevant? Okay. it's relevant because as we've just kind of described here, the lower we go on these numbers, the more it acts like a lock diff. The higher we go, the more it acts like an open. But we've also kind of got not the full range, I would say, in terms of what's available. In the sense that even maxed out, these numbers are not completely like an open diff. And well, at either end, they're not completely like an open diff, and they're not completely like a lock diff. So because of that, that's kind of where the friction faces come in. They allow you to multiply the effect up. Now, the diff preload is a little bit of a quirky thing on its own. What that does is that's there to add a kind of, well, the other three settings act depending on how much power is going down and so on and so on. So they kind of build up, and the locking effect gets more the kind of more load there is going on. The diff preload is a different thing. The diff preload is something that it doesn't increase depending on the amount of slip or so on. It's just there. And what that does is that adds a static amount of locking. So if we were to go all the way down to 0, which we can, that's pretty much allowing it to be as close to a completely open diff as possible. And if we go to 200, that's making it more like a lock diff, but only in a static scenario. So this number is something that is kind of different from the other three, and hopefully we'll be able to demonstrate that. So what we're going to do first is we're just gonna take it out with these middle of the road settings and just give you kind of a baseline of how that works. And what we're going to do that is we're going to go out to the 100 mark, and then we're just going to kind of do a couple of tests of slowly getting into the gas and then kind of heavily getting into the gas and showing how this applies to the drive ramp angle. So you can see we're doing about 147 Ks. Now if we just blend the power in, you can see how the nose pulls into the corner a little bit. So what that's kind of showing us is that the more we get on the power, and as the diff locks up, it kind of it's biased in a way where the more power we're applying, the more oversteer we're getting. So there's quite a bit of locking effect already. And you can see where if we now just go completely hammer down, the car will go around into a spin. So for our next test, what we will do is we will take the drive ramp angle all the way to the maximum locking effect. So what this should do, going down to 40 degrees, is this should make the effects that I've just shown even more prominent. So it should now be even more throttle sensitive. And when I go hammer down, it should really want to kick out. So that's really kind of what you're tuning here with these ramp angles is the throttle sensitivity of it, at least on the drive ramp side. So we're back at 100 again, and you can see there where we've still got that same effect where as we bleed the throttle in, it tries to hook the nose in and tries to kind of loop us around. And now if we hammer down, you can see that it actually snaps away, you know, almost more aggressively than it previously did. So now our last test with the drive ramp angle is going to be going from 40 to 80. So this is going from as more from a locked perspective to now more unlocked. And again, we'll go out to 100. And we'll go up to 147 again. Now we'll blend the power in slowly. And you can see that that's probably the most obvious example right there. You can see how we blend the power in slowly, and actually the nose doesn't even turn in more at all because there's so little locking. The nose actually pushes out of the corner. And now if we do the same test of just hammer down again, you can see that while the car does go around, it's much more progressive and it's much less violent. So you can see how the lower the locking effect is on the drive side, the kind of more docile the car is. It's kind of where we're trying to stop, but you get the idea. So now, I feel like that's pretty clearly demonstrated the drive ramp angle. And now what I want to do is I want to demonstrate the kind of what the clutch faces do. So we're at 6 right now. We're going to go back down to 60 on the drive ramp angle. So back to our baseline. I'm just going to do that once more just to kind of show that. So now we're kind of at the midway amount of locking between the lowest and the highest numbers. And you can see how the nose is back where it'll tuck in again, and where we stand on the power, it'll go around again. But you can see how even with just kind of halfway setting, that's way more aggressive. But now what we'll do is we'll go from 6 plates down to 2. And what this does is this again reduces the amount of locking, because this acts like a multiplier to the ramp angles effectively. So this should be similar to what we had before with the higher drive ramp angle. And we can see that it kind of is. It's not exactly the same. The effect is slightly different. And what you have to remember with the clutch plates is that when you're changing this, you're multiplying your, well, okay. It acts like a multiplier to your ramp angles in a way. And what that means is that any split between your off and on throttle behavior, so between your drive and your coast behaviors, the more clutch plates you use, the bigger that difference is going to be. So keep that in mind, because if you have vastly different coast and drive locking effects, the more clutch plates you put in, the bigger that difference is going to get. So we'll just do the test again where we get on the power, and then we'll try and get heavy in the power again. And you can see how it will still go around, but it goes around in a little bit of a different way. Now we'll try it with 12 clutch plates. So 12 is again a lot more locking. You might be wondering why I haven't talked about the coast setting yet, and that's because this test doesn't really do a great job of demonstrating the coast setting, so we're going to show that afterwards. We're going back to 147 again, roughly. I'm going to bleed the power in, and you can see how now with more clutch plates and more locking, it's again back to being more throttle sensitive, where it'll want to hook the nose round more. And then if we go hammer down, it pretty easily loops the car.
16.93.
So I feel like that should have done a decent explanation of both the clutch plates and the drive ramp angle numbers. And now what we're going to do is we're going to now go back to Most Sport, where we'll hopefully be able to demonstrate coast ramp angles and the preload a bit more effectively. Now, the reason the skid pan doesn't really work very well for both preload and coast ramp angles is because there's no real defined corners, and because there's no real defined corners, it just it makes it difficult to demonstrate how those two work. And Moss Corner from at Mosport is a really good demonstrator specifically of preload, and the preceding corners up to that I found demonstrated pretty well the effects of coast ramp angle. But the skid pan is great for showing the drive ramp angle and the clutch plates. And if you do have any questions or comments on this, please let me know, and please put them in the comment section of the video, or contact me directly. I'm happy to talk about things and go over them. So again, we're going to go back into the garage, and you can see I just need to put our clutch plates back down to 6. So we're going to go back with our baseline. We're not going to do a full lap because just going out of the pits and down to Moss Corner, that's going to be enough to demonstrate. Kind of like how the skid pan is enough to demonstrate the drive ramp angle. So yep, 50, 66, and 100, that is baseline. Now, the corner I really want to focus on for the coast ramp angle effects is not this one, but this next right-hander. Keep in mind this is the baseline. You see I have to work the wheel a little bit through there. Not the best line, but hopefully that'll show you that it's pretty tame. Right now, I wouldn't describe the handling as neutral, but I would describe it as okay. The first thing we're going to try is we're going to go from 50 on our coast ramp up to 70. So this is the least amount of locking, and what this should mean is that in the off-throttle portions, where we're completely out of the gas, we should now have more rotation. I personally find that the coast settings are much more subtle than the drive settings. Yeah, I'm not sure how much that comes through on video, but it felt like the nose was a lot more pointy. I'm sure that came across though. You can see how in the transition between the two parts of the corner, when I got completely out of the gas, the rear wanted to jump around much more with the lower locking on the coast side. So now we're going to go down to maximum locking on the coast side. And what this should do is this should induce more understeering in those scenarios. So hopefully what you'll see is that the car will want to turn less on the off-throttle right-hander, and in the double right, my prediction is that the nose will kind of wash out more. So coming down to the right. So for me right there, it felt like when I got off the throttle that the nose just didn't want to turn in at all. And then through there. It actually feels quite comfortable, but it feels quite comfortable because the nose is trying to push me out of the corner. Now, like I say, it feels not obvious, but it's noticeable for me when I'm driving it. I don't know how noticeable it is on video, but you can kind of conduct this test yourself, and I would hope that you'll get a similar answer to what I have. So that's going over the ramp angles and the friction faces. as hopefully you can see, the lower the number you go on the ramp angles, the more locking force you have. So what that means is that when you're off throttle, if your ramp angle on the coast side is very low, that means you're gonna have more understeer. And if you're on throttle and your drive ramp angle is very low, I think from the skid pan tests you can see that the car becomes significantly more throttle sensitive, and that abrupt applications of power will definitely kick the tail out, and you will definitely get more oversteer. So now coming to the last thing. Oh, actually, one last note on the friction faces. As we kind of saw from the skid pan, the friction faces multiply the effects of the ramp angles, and that's kind of where it comes into what I personally found is a decent way of doing this, is to find the handling bias I want with the ramp angles first, and then adjust the number of clutch faces to see if I either at optimal or I can maybe get away with more or less locking. And what I found is that once I've kind of got my ramp angles set, they seem to transfer fairly well between circuits, and then I can just change my number of friction faces and occasionally the preload to get the balance I want. But we'll do one last test where, well, I say one last, it's going to be two more, because we're going to go from 100 to 200 Newton meters of preload. Now, remembering what I said about this before, about how this is a static force that is always there, so it has to be overcome by the conditions. And what that means is that it's kind of always, there's always a little bit of lockup. And what I personally found is the more preload you run, the more it kind of smooths the transition between going on and off throttle. So going between the two ramp angles. So this is maximum preload coming down through Moss. Not my best corner, but you can see how the car again seems relatively planted. It doesn't seem unpredictable. And now what we're going to do is we're going to show you what zero preload looks like. So remembering what I was saying about how the preload is a static force that needs to be overcome, this should be a good example of how the preload affects the transition behavior going between the two scenarios of coast and drive. You can see there how the rear kicked out a bit more. That might just be down to the fact that there's less locking now on the coast side. But you can definitely see there, and that demonstrated pretty much what I was hoping, in that I don't know if you could hear it, but it definitely sounds when you're running less or zero preload, it definitely sounds like you've got way more of an open diff in the car, in the sense that I could hear the RPM go up, but I definitely didn't feel like I was getting any drive. And for me personally, I find that low preload numbers makes the car feel very unpredictable, especially in transition behaviors when you're going between on and off throttle and onto the brakes and so on. And I believe I have actually made it through that without making any completely egregious screw-ups. So, because of that, I'm going to end the video there, and I hope that was helpful, and I hope that was much better than my previous attempt at explaining this. I will link the first attempt in the description of this video, but I am going to be not removing that video, but it will become unlisted and you'll only be able to get access to it via this one. To anybody that's new or enjoys this kind of content, and especially if you enjoy racing, you should definitely come and check out some of the Twitch streams, because I do try and go over what I'm doing with setup for cars, especially this car. And especially recently, we've had some really great racing on there as well, and I'm really happy with how the Twitch channel is growing, and people seem really interested in it, and there's a good group of guys that hang out over there a lot now. So I'm super thankful to the people who come over to Twitch, and I'm still super thankful to the people who watch the stuff on YouTube. I know that there's a good group of people who like to watch the setup series videos back. And yeah, thank you. I will catch you another time, and if this was helpful, let me know. If this wasn't, if this didn't cover things as well as you wanted it to, again, let me know, and I'll make a third attempt at this, and hopefully we'll get it right. Or if you got any other questions, I know that there's questions about dampers, and I'll make an effort to try and go over that soon. Yeah, thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.